Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching vSphere Data Protection Introduction and Installation. I'll start this lesson off with an introduction to vSphere Data Protection. This is especially important because with vSphere 5.1 they've introduced an all-new product, and that product is vSphere Data Protection. Let's learn what it is and how it can help you. Now, you may be thinking that you've heard of vSphere Data Protection, or VDP, before. If it wasn't with vSphere 5.1, then most likely you're thinking of another product that sounded similar or did something similar, because with vSphere 5.1, vSphere Data Protection, or VDP, is an all-new product included with vSphere 5.1, starting with Essentials Plus Edition and above. VDP is a VMware virtual infrastructure backup and recovery application. So it backs up your vSphere virtual machines and it recovers your vSphere virtual machines or even individual files inside. With vSphere 5.1, VDP is a complete replacement for a previous backup and recovery application that VMware provided called VMware Data Recovery, or VDR. So with vSphere 5.1, VDR, or VMware Data Recovery, has been completely discontinued, and the new replacement going forward is VDP, or vSphere Data Protection. VDP is deployed as a virtual appliance in your vSphere virtual infrastructure. That virtual appliance has 4 vCPUs and 4 gigabytes of RAM by default, and then you can deploy the VMDK, or the virtual disk, inside the virtual appliance that will be used to store your virtual machine backups in a variety of different sizes. It does require that you have vCenter 5.1 or greater, and it will actually back up virtual machines that are running on vSphere 4.0 or higher. This VDP backup and recovery application is completely administered through the vSphere web client, and it's fully compatible with the new vSphere 5.1 web client interface. As I mentioned, VDP offers a virtual appliance deployment. That means you don't have to create a new virtual machine, install a Windows operating system, perhaps install a database, install a backup application, and point it to your vCenter server before you can start backing up your virtual machines. You simply download the virtual appliance, deploy the virtual appliance, it automatically recognizes your vCenter server, and with just a few clicks you can start backing up all the virtual machines that you might add over time in your vSphere virtual infrastructure. The configuration is super simple. There's no agents to install on the virtual machines. The user interface has been greatly improved over VMware's data recovery backup application. The virtual machine backup data that's stored in the backup repository is deduplicated so that it takes up the most minimal amount of space possible. Change block tracking is utilized on the virtual machine disk files so that only the change blocks of each virtual machine disk are backed up. That means that backups can happen extremely quick when you're performing an incremental. VDP does use VADP, or the VMware API for data protection, to take advantage of the change block tracking feature. Additionally, file level restore and email reporting are included. Now, one limitation is that you can only store your virtual machine backup data on the VDP virtual appliance. This is unlike VMware Data Recovery, where you could choose to restore that backup data in an SMB or a Windows file share. That made it very easy to then put that backup data onto tape using a traditional physical server backup application. However, that's simply not possible with vSphere Data Protection. So I do consider that a limitation over VMware Data Recovery. Another thing I want to clear up is that VDP is not based on EMC Avamar. VMware did collaborate with EMC's Avamar team in the creation of vSphere Data Protection, but it is not based on EMC Avamar according to VMware. Now let's move on and talk about some limitations of vSphere Data Protection. Now, even VMware says that VDP is not the proper solution if you're looking for a large-scale, enterprise-wide data protection application. That's because vSphere Data Protection has a number of scalability limitations. For example, the first one is that you can only back up to 100 virtual machines per VDP virtual appliance. So if each vCenter server can support up to 10 VDP appliances, and you can back up 100 virtual machines per appliance, then you have a limitation of 1,000 virtual machines per vCenter server. However, once you go past a single VDP virtual appliance, then you're going to have to manage each one of those VDP appliances and the backup jobs inside individually. So that would actually, in my opinion, create a huge management headache to have multiple VDP virtual appliances. So my recommendation would be, if you have more than 100 virtual machines, or you think you will within the next few years at a single location that's managed by a single vCenter server, then I would start looking for other third-party backup solutions. So just keep that in mind. VDP may be a great solution for, let's say, a small remote office that has 25 virtual machines and they need a local backup and recovery application. This is completely free. It's included with vSphere Essentials Plus and above, so it might be an excellent solution for them. However, in a large enterprise data center where, let's say, you're going to convert 200 physical servers over time into the virtual infrastructure, VDP would not be a good solution in my opinion, because you're going to certainly hit that 100 virtual machine limitation on each virtual appliance, causing you to have to deploy multiple virtual appliances, and in that case I would say start looking for a good third-party backup application. Another limitation is that you can only back up to 2 terabytes of deduplicated virtual machine data per virtual appliance. So there is yet another limitation in terms of scalability for vSphere data protection. There's no option to store your virtual machines anywhere but on the appliance. As I said with the previous VMware backup application, VDR, you could store your virtual machine data onto a Windows file share, and then you could easily back that up with your traditional physical server backup application, send it to tape, and get it off-site. But that's simply not the case with VDR. All the data is going to have to be stored on the VMDK for the vSphere Data Protection virtual appliance. So there's no option provided by VDP to get your virtual machines off-site. Replication is not included with vSphere Data Protection. Of course, VMware does have vSphere Replication, which I'll talk about in another lesson, but that's not included or integrated with vSphere Data Protection. It's a completely separate solution. So those are the limitations of vSphere Data Protection. Just keep those in mind when you go and start selecting a backup and recovery solution for your virtual infrastructure. You'll want to think about how your virtual infrastructure is going to grow and scale over time, and if vSphere Data Protection is the correct solution. Now, if you're preparing for your VMware Certified Professional in Data Center Virtualization exam, then absolutely you need to know about vSphere Data Protection, and most likely you want to deploy it in a lab environment and learn about it as much as you can, because it is a topic on the VCP DV examination blueprint. Now that we've learned the features as well as the limitations of vSphere Data Protection, let's get started with the installation. Before we go about deploying vSphere Data Protection, here's a few things that you need to know. VDP is available in the 60-day evaluation version of VMware vSphere. That means you can try it at no cost for 60 days. The latest version at the time that I'm creating this lesson is version 5.1. It fully integrates with the vSphere web client, and it can protect even your powered-off virtual machines. After you perform the deployment of the VDP virtual appliance, the URL that you'll need to know is going to be https:// the IP or the domain name, if you registered it, of the VDP virtual appliance, /8543/vdp-configure. The default username is root, and the default password is change me. So with that, let's go over to our vSphere web client, and we'll get started by deploying the new vSphere Data Protection virtual appliance. Here I am in my VMware vSphere web client over in my lab at the Wired Brain Coffee Company. Now, to get started deploying vSphere Data Protection, the first thing I did is I went and downloaded it from VMware's Download Center. Here's what it looks like. You'll find vSphere Data Protection in with other downloads related to VMware vSphere. It's not listed as its own product, such as VMware Site Recovery Manager or vCenter Operations Manager. You'll find VDP, again, inside the vSphere 5.1 downloads. If I scroll down here, notice that under the Essentials product, there is no VDP listed. That's because it doesn't come with Essentials. The first version that it comes with is Essentials Plus. So here we see vSphere Data Protection 5.1.1, and I actually downloaded it right here. It is included, of course, with other versions of vSphere, including Standard, Enterprise, and Enterprise Plus. If we go into the download section, for vSphere Data Protection here, we can download 5.10 or 5.11. I did download the latest 5.11, and if I scroll down here, you can see the various packages that it's deployed in. So if we start at the top here, first I've got the vSphere Data Protection OVA in the 1.0 terabyte virtual appliance format. Now the file size here is still 2.4 gigabytes, but it's actually going to provide a 1 terabyte backup repository for your virtual machine backups. The next virtual appliance OVA listed here provides a 2 terabyte backup repository, and then the third virtual appliance you can download here offers a 0.5 terabyte or a 500 gigabyte backup repository for your virtual machines. So in other words, the backup repository for these virtual appliances are pre-sized. The fourth item on the download list here is the upgrade files that you would need to upgrade from a previous version of VMware Data Recovery, for example, to go from 5.10 to 5.11. So in my case, I've already downloaded the vSphere Data Protection virtual appliance that offers the 2 terabyte pre-configured backup repository, and I put that out on a Windows file share. So let's go to the vSphere client and let's start deploying this new OVA virtual appliance so we can get vSphere Data Protection up and running to start protecting the virtual machines at the Wirebrain Coffee Company. Okay, here I am in my vSphere web client. As you can see here, I've got a couple hosts and I've got quite a few different virtual machines. All these virtual machines need to be backed up, and we'll be using vSphere Data Protection to do it. So to get started deploying VDP, I'm going to go up here to the Actions drop down and go down and click on Deploy OVF Template. Now the first thing we're prompted to do here is to select the source of the OVA or OVF file that we're going to be deploying. We could select either a URL, for example, a internet URL to deploy the package directly from the internet, or we could choose a local file. In my case, I've already downloaded the file to save us time, so I'll just click Browse here. It's actually an OVA file instead of an OVF. I'll say All Files here. And you can see here's the vSphere Data Protection 2 terabyte backup repository virtual appliance that I've already downloaded. It's about 2.4 gigabytes, just as they advertised over on the site. I'll click Open here. The path is pasted in. I'll click Next. It checks out the virtual appliance and tells us we're about to deploy vSphere Data Protection 5.1 from VMware. The download size is 2.3 gigs. The size on disk will be 6.4 gigs if we use thin provisioning, or 3 terabytes if we use thick provisioning. I'll click Next here. We'll accept the end user license agreement, click Next, and then we need to select a location for the VDP virtual appliance. I'll deploy it into my Hilton Head, South Carolina virtual data center and click Next. We're asked to select a resource. In this case, I've got a cluster. I'll select the cluster and click Next. The next thing we're asked about is to select the virtual disk format and the storage location of the data store that we want to deploy the vSphere Data Protection virtual machine to. In the case of most production virtual machines, you would select thick provisioning for best performance. However, with the vSphere Data Protection virtual appliance, they actually recommend thin provisioning. So I'm going to use thin provisioning, not just because this is my lab environment and because I don't actually have a lot of space in my storage area network available, but I'm going to use thin provisioning because in the case of vSphere Data Protection, those are the best practices. So I'll select thin provisioning and then my Drobo 4 terabyte storage area network and click Next. Next, we're prompted to select which virtual network we'd like the virtual appliance to be connected to. In our case, I've just got one virtual network, so I'll take the default here and click Next. Next, we're prompted to configure the IP network addressing for the virtual appliance. I'll just type in my default gateway here, my DNS server, the IP address that I'll configure on the VDP virtual appliance itself, and the subnet mask. We'll want to remember this IP address. In this case, it's 10.01.192 because we'll be connecting to it here shortly. I'll click Next. Now we get a final confirmation of what we're about to do. I'll select to power on the virtual appliance after deployment and click Finish. After a few minutes, I can see down here that the vSphere Data Protection virtual appliance has been created, but I can't yet power it on because the deployment actually is still in progress. We do see here a little information about it. Again, 4 virtual CPUs, 4 gigs of RAM. We've got a 100 gigabyte base disk and then numerous 256 gigabyte virtual disks to create the 2 terabyte backup repositories total capacity. Now, to check on the status of this, because it is a relatively large virtual appliance, 2.4 gigs, we'll go to the home screen and then into Tasks. And here we can see that the deploy OVF template task for vSphere Data Protection is currently 78% completed. I'll monitor the deployment process from here, and I'll be right back as soon as we're done. After a few minutes, the VMware Data Protection virtual appliance has been successfully deployed, and as you can see here, it's also powered on, and we can see an image there of the console. If we open up the console from the vSphere web client, this is what you see, and I recommend that you follow the quick start guide that's listed here. So step 1 is to open your browser to https:// the IP address of the VDP virtual appliance, :8543/VDP-configure. From there, what we'll do is we'll configure the network settings, the time zone, VDP credentials, vCenter registration information. We'll test the connection to vCenter, and then the configuration of VDP will be complete. So now let's open our browser to that URL that they specified there. And this is what we see. Here we can log in as root, and the default password is change.me. And that brings up the VDP configuration wizard, and this is what we'll use to configure the settings that they just mentioned: the network settings, time zone, VDP credentials, and the connection to your VMware vCenter server. So I'll click Next here to get started. Now, in our case, we went ahead and configured the IP addressing when we deployed the VDP virtual appliance. So I really don't need to configure the IP addressing again here, but I would like to configure the host name. So I'll call this VDP1 because this is going to be my first VDP virtual appliance deployment. And then the domain here is thewiredbraincoffeecompany.com. Whether you're running VDP in a production environment or a lab environment, if you're going to enter a host name here, you also need to go and configure a DNS alias for the VDP virtual appliance. So let's go do that real quick. On the DNS server for the Wired Brain Coffee Company, I'm just going to right-click here and go up and create a new host entry. This new host entry will be called VDP1. The IP address will be the IP address we configured on the VDP virtual appliance. I'll click Add Host here. It says that the host name record was successfully created. I'll click OK. I'll click Done. There's the entry there. Also note you do need, besides a forward entry, you also need a reverse entry. So that reverse lookup zone needs to be present for that IP network mapping used by the VDP virtual appliance. So with that entry created in DNS, let's go back to the VDP virtual appliance configuration. And with our IP addressing and DNS entries configured here, I'll just click Next. And now we can configure the time zone for the VDP virtual appliance. I'll scroll down because the Wired Brain Coffee Company is located in Hilton Head, South Carolina. At least that's where their headquarters is. So in that case, the time zone is America, New York. I'll click Next. And now we're prompted to change the VDP root user credentials. So the password for the root user that you log into the VDP virtual appliance with. This password is very specific. Notice here it says it must have 9 characters. That does not mean at least 9 characters. It means exactly 9 characters. So to be candid with you, it was very tough for me actually to come up with a password that was exactly 9 characters and met all these other requirements here because I couldn't use any of my normal passwords. So it has to be exactly 9 characters, and to me that should say exactly 9 characters. Additionally, it has to have at least 1 uppercase letter, 1 lowercase letter, 1 number, and no special characters, whereas other passwords in most cases require you to have at least 1 special character. So it's a very strange password in my opinion. So in my case, I'm going to type VMware123 because that password actually does work, and I'm capitalizing the VM on VMware123. I know that's not a very secure password, but for my lab environment, that's a password that works, and it's a password that I can remember. You'll have to come up with your own, much more secure password for your production VDP virtual appliance. I'll click Next here. Here we need to enter the vCenter username. In this case, it's administrator, because I'm connecting this to the Windows-based vCenter, and my vCenter password, which is also my domain administrator password, my vCenter hostname, which is just vCenter, my SSO hostname, which in this case is just vCenter. It's the same host that I'm using, and I've got another lesson coming on SSO or single sign-on, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail here. But in this case, the SSO hostname is the same as my vCenter server. Here I'll click to test the connection. And we get the message the connection did not complete successfully. We need to check our network settings or VDP credentials and then click Test Connection again to run the test. I'll click OK. Let's figure out what's wrong here. So vCenter server, vCenter password, vCenter hostname. Let's try out the fully qualified domain name and click Test Connection. And we get a new error message. It says insufficient user privileges. The specified user either is not a dedicated VDP user or does not have sufficient vCenter privileges to administer VDP. Please update your user role and try again. I'll click OK here, and I'll tell you right up front, the problem is that with VDP, you need to go in and authorize the Windows administrator account to also be a vCenter administrator. That's just part of the setup requirements. That's something that needs to be done. So let's go back over to our vSphere client. And here in the vSphere web client, I'm going to click on my vCenter server inside the hosts and clusters inventory. I'm going to go into the Manage tab, then into Permissions. And here is the administrators group. I'm going to click here to Add. And the user account I'm going to add is under the domain, actually the Wired Brain Coffee Company domain. And then I'll select the Windows Administrator account. Now that's one way to do it. Really the best practice would be to create a vSphere Administrators group and then put your vSphere admins in that group and then authorize that group. In this case, and in small shops, they're typically just going to authorize the Windows Administrator account. Then I'll click Add. The administrator account's down here. Notice how it is specified here. This is exactly how we need to specify the domain/username over in the VDP configuration. I'll say OK. Now the Wired Brain Coffee Company domain admin is listed there, and his role is going to be administrator. So we changed it to vCenter Administrator, and make sure that Propagate is checked down here so that he'll have the administrative role across all the objects managed by this vCenter server. I'll click OK here. And now notice the Wired Brain Coffee Company Administrator has permissions to this vCenter server and all the objects below. So with that, we'll go back to the VDP configuration. And then here for the administrator username, let's make sure that we specify Wired Brain Coffee. And yes, it is spelled with one E because of the character limitation for the Windows Active Directory domain field there. So we've got coffee with 1e/administrator. Now I'll click test connection again. And now we get a different error. Let's say OK there because it says it's unable to connect to the SSO server. Well, that SSO server, notice we've got another problem down here. This is a great case of troubleshooting the VDP configuration. Let's put in the fully qualified domain name there and click test connection again. Hooray! It says the connection test completed successfully. I'll say OK. And just a couple more notes, make sure that you're using vCenter 5.1. And also, I know I didn't go into the SSO configuration here. I've got another lesson that I'll be creating all about single sign-on and SSO related to vCenter 5.1. So with that, we'll click Next. And now we're ready to complete the configuration of our VDP virtual appliance. I'll click Finish. And it says configuration is complete. You may close the screen and reboot your appliance. I'll click OK. Let's go ahead and close out this window. We'll go back into the VDP virtual appliance. I'll right-click on it and go down to Restart Guest Operating System. I'll say OK. I do want to restart the guest operating system. And this reboot will take just a few minutes. At this point, we've successfully deployed the VDP virtual appliance and configured the VDP virtual appliance. And that really concludes this lesson about VMware vSphere data protection, installation, and configuration. For more information on how to backup and recover virtual machines using vSphere data protection, check out my lesson on VDP backup and recovery. Thanks for watching this lesson on vSphere data protection, installation, and configuration.